Hi there. Now I want to look at the way in which comic industry began to explore a rather new genre, something we can only sort of broadly call nonfiction comics. This is different than autobiography and biography, which have been around for a while. Nonfiction comics are really trying to explain an idea or a concept or a history of something in a much more specific context. And how this sort of morphs into this idea of journalism, where an issue is explored, a real issue where real characters are being introduced in the comic medium. Where I see this beginning actually goes back to something we've already talked about earlier. It was Paris, 1968, and the protests there, and the Situationist use of this concept of détournement and their very famous comics, The Return of the Durruti Column, and the popularity of this kind of comic, which spread outward from there all over the Western world. And this kind of comic, this kind of collaged commentary, satirical, anarchic comic style was very appealing actually to Eduardo del Rio, also known as Rios, a very famous comic artist in Mexico. And he came out with a English version of his comic Cuba for Beginners, which talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the US imperial interests in suppressing Cuba. And he created this comic in 1970. And it was a kind of a mixture of cartoons and collaged elements that we could cut and paste and written, sort of creating commentary, much the way he said that he was sort of inspired by the Situationist comics. So in his comic, he actually created, he was this published by Pantheon, originally independently published. Pantheon picks it up, and this is still in print today. This comic has been around forever, and it's been a kind of history of the Cuban Missile Crisis from the perspective of a socialist-leaning anarchist. This style of comic, this sort of narrative thing, had become a kind of new genre. Pantheon began it, and then it was picked up by other publishers. And now this whole writers and readers documentary comic books, these documentary comic books, these are just some of the titles in this sort of quote, for beginners, which all include this kind of mixture of collaged bits and text and bits of dialogue thrown in for humor. And this is a way we create commentary and interest in a subject, usually very complex. You notice from this list how most of the subjects here are very left-leaning in their character. It's a way in which they sort of appealed to college students and became a kind of standard way in which people might want to introduce themselves to a subject which they felt they needed to quickly get up and become accomplished in. Another artist who was reading Cuba for Beginners and inspired by Cuba for Beginners by Rios was Larry Gonick, who was a math graduate student who loved cartooning. And he decides that as a graduate student, he was going to try and do his own kind of nonfiction comics. He began early on by doing a comic about the tax code and the crazy eccentricities of the tax code. And then he fell on this quite crazy idea in 1978 that he was going to do literally the whole history of the universe and as a comic. And it's a very ambitious project, which was only finally completed in 2009. And it's wonderful. It's beautiful. It has a lot of great interest and humor in it. He's very smartly able to draw out the essence of the march of human history, some of the great innovations, some of the fascinating discoveries, but always sort of, you know, the march of human history has its darker sides, the folly of human history is explored in a lot of ways. We get to see the kind of crazy antics that followed great and brilliant discoveries. So Larry Gonick has gone on, and he's actually been an enormously prolific comic artist. Not only did he finish this enormous project, the whole history of the universe as a comic, he's also done many other guides. I've read a number of these, and I find them all fascinating, well done, smartly conceived, and beautifully, visually, graphically represented. So here we start to see, they're not by a whole lot of artists, but quite a number of these sort of comic guides to complex subjects. This leads us to probably one of the most influential books on the nature of comics in the last 20 years. This is Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. It was first published in 1993, and it was sort of independently published at first. Scott McCloud couldn't find someone who was interested in publishing. He became part of the largesse of Eastman and Laird after they had made a killing off their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They turned around and funded Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which is a really funny, engrossing read about what a comic book is. So it's a comic book about comics. And what's really fascinating about comics is it's not about the history of comics, like what comics have been. It's really an investigation of the medium itself, how they communicate, and what they could be. In that case, it's really much more like a manifesto. It's exciting people to think and take comics seriously as a medium for communicating all kinds of ideas. And one of the things that Scott McCloud explores in his history of comics is what he says is this gap, this pair of panels, the sequential action, that one panel, and what happens when you put two different pictures together, the kind of idea that a comic creates, new meaning. And it's this juxtaposition of sequential images that is sort of the hallmark of Scott McCloud's concept of comics. Now, people have questioned this and challenged it and expanded on it in numerous ways, but you have to give him credit. No one had really articulated this in any kind of sophistication, and he takes this kernel idea and he sort of theorizes that there are about 6 different ways you can create sequences. He identifies what those different sequences are, he explains how they work in comics, and how they communicate ideas about time and themes and meaning in the comic medium. Furthermore, in his comic, he goes through and starts to actually look at how comic artists use these different kinds of sequential patterns. And he finds that in American comics, they actually rely on very few of those possible panel sequences. And he finds that in Japan, they're more likely to use a greater variety of comic panel sequences and creating more complex visual storytelling. Now, Joe Sacco has become pretty much the godfather of comics journalism. He began as a journalist. He began as trained in the field, got tired of the fact that he couldn't find any meaningful work doing stories with any kind of import. And so he then took up his hobby as a comic artist. And he began doing kind of personal stories and commentary. This he did a travelogue, which brought him to start talking about his experiences on the ground in wars. And he's done Palestine, footnotes on Gaza, about Israeli-Palestinian relations, safe area, Goraze, and the fixer on the Bosnian War. These are very intense, hard-hitting, powerful stories, sort of in the vein of Art Spiegelman's Mouse, except there aren't no funny animals. He looks brutally at the violence and the complexity of these stories. And he puts himself in his stories, and we are drawn into the stories, and he identifies his own subjective problems in trying to discuss these issues that occur during wartime, places torn by wartime. Here we see a kind of classic panel by Joe Sacco, the kind of powerful way in which he presents his characters. They're not naturalistic. They have a kind of humanity about them, the way they speak, the way they hold themselves, the intensity of their presence. It's all vividly done. And he sort of self-deprecatingly puts himself inside these stories as a kind of comic foil to the action. But ultimately, it's the people he interviews that come across with their kind of powerful sense of being present, their sense of what they are passionately true about. I've included in our reading one of his more recent investigative works into the problems of immigration on the island of Malta, where he was born. And this is a chance for him to explore and talk to the natives who have lived in Malta all their lives, and the huge influx of Africans that have been occurring in the last 20 years. Another artist, Mark Spiegelman, has continued his work in comics, has done a lot of investigative journalism, personal narratives as well. He did In the Shadow of No Towers. He was in New York during the bombing, during the destruction of the World Trade Center, and he escaped downtown as the buildings collapsed. And he tells these stories and his own reaction to America and the changes in the politics that were happening at this time. More calculating and less calculating story with a liberal bias is the 9/11 report, a graphic adaptation. The commissioned, the 9/11 Commission's report has now been sort of graphically told by Sid Jacobson and Ernie Cohn, taking the actual text, bringing out quotes, telling the story visually. This is a great way to read this story. It's a beautifully written original report, won a literature award for its compelling writing. But it's a visual story, and it's one that you often, there's a lot of things happening, overlapping things happening. They lay this out in a kind of graphic way that's very powerful. You get to see the kind of breakdown, communication, and miscommunication that led to this catastrophic day. Another very interesting woman who's been working in graphic novels for some time, who's gone out and done this sort of journalist work, is Jessica Abel. She did, again, like Joe Sacco, she began doing kind of personal narratives in her comic zine, Art Babe. And then she sort of stretches out to start doing stories about things that interest her. She was really fascinated in This American Life and other radio programs where they tell human stories. She finds their storytelling really compelling. She's wondering how they do it, how they tell stories. And so to understand her own interest in narrative and storytelling, she takes on a comic project where she starts to interview these producers of these radio podcasts and how they work and how they generate their ideas. So it's a fascinating book out on the wire, and it really gives her own interest in storytelling and an investigation into how storytelling works on the radio and what we can learn about storytelling from the way they make their radio programs.